Sitting on a concrete floor in the middle of a prison hallway, Chaplain Chris Hoke says he was surrounded by some of Guatemala's most dangerous young criminals. Along the hallway, young men squatted while others leaned out of their cell doorways just to hear this American visitor read the Bible to them in Spanish. Chris is an American chaplain who specializes in working with gang members in American prisons. And he was brought to the Guatemalan prison by ex-gang members who wanted to share the good news of Christ and believed Chris's authentic love for people would help him reach some of these men so they would turn their lives over to God. On that particular visit, Chris read from Acts 7, a story that holds similarities between the life of Saul, who later became Paul, and the men in prison. Many of the men had been children when they were exposed to violence during the Civil War in the 1980s. As children, they stood behind the mob as they witnessed the street executions of their neighbors and family members. Witnessing violence, they joined dangerous gangs for protection and for a sense of community. In the book of Acts, Saul was as ruthless and dangerous as the street gang members as he breathed threats and surrounded himself with a mob, so all feared him. Saul exhibited the same violent aggression that his listeners were familiar with when he dragged families out of their homes and opposed them with an iron fist. After Chris shared Saul's story, he offered the imprisoned gang members hope, revealing that Jesus transformed life's Saul, so that transformed, Saul adopted a new name to create a new start. Chris offered the men an opportunity to meet Christ, revealing that Jesus didn't come with a weapon against Saul. Rather, Jesus came at Saul with compassion and grace. Following Jesus' example, Chris delivered this message with a joyful expectation that God's love can help these men release the trauma that is locked inside them. As Chris provided the gospel of Jesus to these inmates, he says he witnessed Jesus' amazing power in the prison as he watched God form a new generation of radical apostles from among former gang members. Meanwhile, Chris recognizes that preaching God's word places his life in jeopardy. He is aware that gang members both inside and outside the prison view his message as a dangerous one because former members are cutting their ties from their gang affiliation. Though threatened by dangerous gangs in both America and Guatemala, Chris chooses to serve God as he offers guidance to inmates so that their lives are transformed and they reconnect with humanity. He holds the hands of drug dealers and murderers. He kneels to sit on the hard, cold concrete to offer care to a broken person. He sits in the prison cells for hours to connect on a relational level with prisoners. And he says he does it as a response to Jesus' call to feed, tend to, and love Jesus' sheep, even though it is dangerous work. Still, this is the ministry work that Jesus commissioned Peter to embrace when Jesus instructed him to feed my sheep. Earlier in John's Gospel, Jesus revealed that he was the good shepherd. Now, in this morning's passage, Jesus instructed Peter to be an apprentice shepherd, to create a team of apprentice shepherds who would continue the ministry work of Jesus, to tend to, feed, and love Jesus' sheep. To fulfill this commission meant they were to nurture and care for people around them and to love them. For by loving one another, everyone will know you are my disciples, Jesus said. In addition, this meant they weren't commissioned for a short-term, one-and-done ministry work project. Rather, this commission to be an apprentice shepherd was a lifetime commitment which included risk and danger. When Jesus commissioned Peter and the disciples, he used the shepherd metaphor to convey that they would care for others. It was a metaphor they immediately understood because they were familiar with the life of a shepherd, and they understood the danger and risks involved. They also would have recognized that shepherding is muddy, smelly, and difficult work, and it's not for the faint of heart. It takes patience and the ability to adapt to the needs around them, and it takes leading by example to guide the way. Guiding is the only way for shepherd to move sheep to a new location because sheep are not driven like rancher drives cattle. Whereas cows are herded from the rear, sheep are led from the front, and they will not go anywhere that someone else does not go first. In Peter's case, it begins with loving Jesus. Though Jesus' question to Peter could have also been a reversal of his public denial of knowing Jesus when Jesus needed him most. Could have also been a test to see if Peter understood that he must love Jesus first and recognize what love is, so he could love the individuals he encountered as he accepted his new assignment and followed Jesus. Questioning Peter also seems to hammer home the point with Peter and the other disciples that it will take being in love with Jesus to remain a productive shepherd. Because as shepherds, they will be in this role for the long haul. They will experience sacrifice and self-denial, and they will often find it exhausting and difficult work. The same is true for all who follow Jesus, not just persons called to clergy either, or chaplains or pastors. Now, it is true that clergy are shepherd, but the truth is, Jesus' commission to be a shepherd was also meant for all of his followers. All of us have been assigned the responsibility to lead by example and to care for each other through love, feeding and tending to the needs of our social and faith community. One way I see this type of shepherding and saw it in action was when I visited Iona, Scotland. I was on a spiritual pilgrimage with other persons who stayed at the Iona Community Abbey. And the pilgrimage went from the Abbey to the South Beach, then traversed the hills and sheep pastures toward the north end of the island. We were instructed that on our journey, we were responsible for our own well-being. We were to walk only as far as we were comfortable, at a pace we knew our bodies could manage. And at the same time, we were told to keep up with the group. Don't fall behind. Oxymoron, perhaps. We were also instructed to keep our own source of water and to bring what we thought we needed. It was also our responsibility to stay hydrated. And in addition, it was up to us to bring the proper clothing and items we needed for the journey. Although we were also told anything you choose to carry with you, you will have to carry it for the entire trip. So as our tour guide, Ursula, started out, she took the lead, guiding us to each of the checkpoints. And though she had initially instructed us to walk at our own pace as long as we remained as a group, I discovered that as we were going, she constantly adapted our pace as a group to the slowest of our walkers. No one was left behind. And though she had told us we were responsible to bring enough fluids for the journey and not to expect any more, as some of our younger members ran out of water early on in the pilgrimage, she began distributing bottled water to them and then to the rest of us. And then as we were refilling our water containers, this allowed us to be generous with our own water and share it with each other as well. Ursula understood that to be a good shepherd, the walk wasn't about her. It was about the group. As we followed her around the island, she patiently adapted her agenda so we could remain as a group. And as a group, we saw God revealed as we cared for each other, carrying bags for each other, sharing jackets, and even huddling together when the chilly air blew across the island. She was also supportive when she had to make unplanned stops so we could rest. And then we also had to wait for someone to use the restroom. And then she created a meditative prayer right off the cuff when we were unable to visit the quarry due to the heavy rains from the previous night, which summed up her role as a guide. We came first. This was the lesson Jesus had been teaching his disciples when he guided them towards spiritual maturity. Early in his ministry, Peter and the disciples seemed to expect that they would be beneficiaries when Jesus became king in Israel after he drove Rome out of Israel. Somehow, they missed what Jesus had been teaching, and they believed they would directly benefit from Jesus' fame and rule as king. As Jesus and Peter sat on the beach, Peter finally understood Jesus' teachings and realized that being Jesus' disciple wasn't about fame, it wasn't about glory, it wasn't about power. It was about developing a deep love for Jesus so we could mirror Jesus' care as he cared for the people around him, placing the needs of others first. Jesus made it clear to Peter that to be a disciple is to exercise love in action, and it requires total servanthood. This means as a shepherd, he would have to see discipleship as a sacrificial work, which sometimes mandates getting on the floor with someone or being a comforting presence while they endure the muck that is in their life. One author says, "You can tell how alien someone is to our life of faith by how terrified of the muck they look." Being a shepherd disciple requires that we are willing to get down and get dirty with the people's sheep, to take on their mess and have their smell all over us. After all, many of us come to faith in a mess, and we can't be afraid of the muck. Author and blogger Shelley Esser wrote that last spring when she was in Chicago, she was standing on the famous Magnificent Mile on Michigan Avenue and was looking at the incredible beauty of the city. Large buildings soared overhead, both old and shiny new ones. Horse-drawn carriages clopped down the street as she was passed by tourists and shoppers wearing designer labels. She says it was beautiful. Then beneath the glamour, she saw them. Burrowed away in doorways and leaning against light poles were the homeless. A reminder that all was not so beautiful, all was not right. She writes that each block she walked, she saw them. A mother cradling her children in a darkened doorway. A man covered up from head to ankles in a sheet with bare legs hanging out. Some lay on mats, others on bundles of old clothes. Both black and white people, all of them broken and bruised. The most challenging part for her, she confessed, is that she wanted to know their story, but she was afraid to step near them. She was afraid to become involved in their muck. Reflecting on her reaction to the homeless that was around her, she admits, though we always claim others have a messy faith and we point our fingers at them, however, when we closely look at the mirror, we realize the person looking back also has a messy faith. We say we love the poor, the broken, the messy, but it requires that we step into their lives and show compassion and offer an ear for hearing and listening. We withdraw, fearful. Fearful that if we get involved, we won't be able to control the situation. We won't know how to help. Or worse, some of them have been invisible for so long, they may want a hug or a handshake, some type of contact to remind them they are human and to let them know they are seen and loved. That idea can be frightening because they could have a bug or bugs, and they certainly have an aroma that could and will transfer. Apparently, Jesus knew that when he informed Peter that by feeding his lambs, that would result in being taken where he did not want to go. No wonder Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Jesus knew Peter would be challenged and tested, and he wanted to cement his commitment to remain a shepherd. Jesus recognized that commitments to family and to serving the church would stretch him, just as they stretch us. And clearly, being a shepherd is not an easy task. After all, it is tempting to give in to fear and avoid people. It's tempting to avoid messy people and scary situations where we might risk our lives, and we might at times hide our anxiety by complaining about situations or other people, just as Peter attempted to deflect his own anxiety when later in John's Gospel he pointed to a different disciple and asked, "Well, what about him?" Peter's attempt to deflect his fear reveals that the work of loving others as Christ loved us will be difficult. And it will be tempting to complain or compare our work to the work of someone else. Yet, and most importantly, Jesus urges us to recall that our goal is not to focus on our own spiritual growth or our faith activities. Rather, our shepherding lives are about glorifying God. The goal is for God to be revealed through our love as we meet the needs of each other through care and compassion. Our ability to surrender our lives to God as we love one another as Jesus loved us enables us to concentrate on being intimately involved with the people, aka Jesus' sheep. Like the shepherds who are out in the pastures, as we care for people, we are asked, are we really in love with Jesus? Are we so in love with Jesus that we are willing to lay down our lives for each other and to focus on the goal of glorifying God? Are we willing to love each other so that our expression of love becomes similar to the ultimate expression of love that was displayed by Jesus on Good Friday, which then is evident to everyone? Accepting our roles as shepherds, let us sit on concrete floors or on street corners or in doorways or wherever God takes us as we love those whom we encounter, so that as we love one another, we display our love of Jesus, the one who says, follow me.